Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. I recently had the pleasure of talking again with Dr. Steve Turley. You may have seen my earlier conversations with him on the subject of the resurgence of religion within the world, as well as more recently, we talked about different conceptions of time within secular and religious cultures. So, in what's sort of becoming a series, because it's really a lot of fun to talk with him, this time we talked about space and views of space and how space is used and thought of and so on in secular versus religious societies. So, if you don't know who Dr. Steve Turley is, reading from his biography, Dr. Turley is an internationally recognized scholar, speaker, and classical guitarist. He is also the author of Awakening Wonder, A Classical Guide to Truth, Goodness, and Beauty, and the Ritualized Revelation of the Messianic Age, Washings and Meals in Galatians and 1 Corinthians. He blogs on the church, society and culture, education, and the arts at turleytalks.com. He's a faculty member at Tall Oaks Classical School in Newcastle, Delaware, where he teaches theology, Greek, rhetoric, and a professor of the fine arts at Eastern University. He lectures at universities, conferences, and churches throughout the United States and abroad. His research and writings have appeared in such journals as Christianity and Literature, Calvin Theological Journal, First Things, Touchstone, and the Chesterton Review. He and his wife, Akiko, have 4 children and live in Newark, Delaware, where they together enjoy fishing, gardening, and watching Duck Dynasty marathons. So I hope you find this conversation and the subject matter as interesting as I did. And so without further ado, here you go. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Turley, for joining me once again. It was a great pleasure talking with you before. And first, actually, we talked about, previously, the last time we talked about time and religious and secular conceptions of time. So, of course, naturally, today we're going to be talking about space. But before we jump into it, could you define again, for those who didn't see before, what religious means, where it comes from, and the idea of it?
Yeah, the term religion is probably the most misunderstood term, given several decades of sort of secular redefinition of the term. And fortunately, its original meaning is coming back into vogue, as it were. Originally, the term religion, it comes from 2 words, re and ligare, which means to retie or rebind. That's where we get the word religio from. And it fundamentally had to do with social obligations. We tend to think of religion as modernists as something that's personal and private, a subjective persuasion, as it were. But historically, you couldn't have gotten a more public term. It was objective. It was thoroughly political in this sense. Religion had to do with your social obligations. So I like to give the example to my students that, when grandma sends you a check for your birthday, what's the first thing your parents tell you that you have to do? Well, after you've opened the card and you saw that check, what do you got to do? You got to phone up grandma and you have to say thank you, right? That's your religion. That's your social obligation. Now, back in the day, obviously that had to do with the gods, depending on what city you were in and so forth. But it also had to do with your responsibility to your family, responsibility to your community, the city, state, to your employment guild, all kinds of things. So it wasn't just simply deities that you were dealing with when you're dealing with religion. We use the term similar today when we're talking about, say, like Buddhism or Taoism or Confucianism, that don't have any defined deity connected with them. That was the way religion was used for centuries, up to about the 18th, 19th century. It was a social obligation. Then 18th and 19th century, with the rise of the Enlightenment, you got this notion that religion could not be social obligation because religion did not involve knowledge anymore. Religion was simply private personal belief. Knowledge was limited solely to the empirically verifiable, the scientifically rational. And anything that flunked that kind of methodological test or was impervious to the test itself was considered to be outside of the purview of knowledge. So how could I hold you obliged to anything that you have no knowledge of? And now religion was purely a matter of private belief. And so the term got radically altered over the last several decades. And only now, with more of the rise of a post-secular consciousness, are we starting to see a return to the original meaning, where religion is really the basis of social order for culture.
Okay, so having laid that groundwork, so that anyone who missed previous conversations is sort of caught up with us. Last time we talked about how different conceptions of time, and it largely had to do with things like how time was segmented and how time was viewed in the relationships between them. So of course, at that sort of high level, the same will apply to space. That there are different ways of looking at space and how you divide up space and the relationships between these divisions. So, would you rather start with the secular view of space or the religious view of space?
Well, how about space just in general? That's probably a good way of doing it. And then maybe we can get into the way secularization rearranges the space. That'd be interesting. Yeah, I think well, actually, we'll do the opposite. Let's talk about space, and then let's talk about the traditional conception of space, and then second.
Keep the historical order.
Go chronological there. So when we're thinking about space, I think we have to think of it reciprocally. I think space is both an extension of ourselves, but it is also something that profoundly shapes and fosters the self. And this is largely because the self exists in a body. The self is inseparable from the body, and the body indwells space. And so it is through the body and the indwelling of space that the self is able to impose itself on space, but it's also space through the body that it imposes itself on the self. So I think what we have to do is I think everybody gets a sense of this, that they know there are various spaces that evoke various orientations, dispositions, and the like. So a sports arena will evoke very different feelings than a restaurant, and a cathedral is going to evoke very different feelings than, say, a nightclub. They're similar, but regardless, the space does affect the way we feel and the way we perceive the world. And scholars are noting that religion or space is inextricably linked to the whole notion of knowledge, because I know something only to the extent that I can understand it, and I understand it largely in relation to how I relate to it. So I know a tree not simply by a definition of a tree, but because I see the tree and because of what I do with the tree. What do I do? Do I climb it? Do I cut it down? Do I decorate it? How I interact with the materiality around me is going to affect the way I actually know and understand the world. So scholars have always taken very seriously space. And when you get into the development of space throughout the centuries, what you see, of course, is the notion of sacred and profane, as it were, or degrees of sacred. So the Greek polis, the city-state, was founded more or less on the temple. The temple itself was found on a sacred space. And then it's built around the sacred space, and its architecture is supposed to evoke the sense of the sacred, the set apart. And then the city comes around that as extensions of the sacred. We see very much the same thing, say, in medieval urban planning. I had the benefit of studying in Durham University, which is a cathedral town in England. And the most prominent building, of course, is the cathedral. There's just no way around that. The castle was paltry by comparison. But interestingly enough, of course, the castle was just right across the green from the cathedral, because church and state are working together here. So you could see that in the spatial arrangements. But the cathedral's at the center. And then in medieval urban planning, Keith Lilly did some really interesting research on how oftentimes the walls around the city would be circular. And he found that represented the cosmos. And there would often be 4 gates, and the 4 gates would represent the 4 gospels. And 4 is also a cosmic number for earth, air, fire, and water. And hence why we have 4 gospels. All things are reconverging around Christ. And the streets would oftentimes be straight in order to fulfill Isaiah 40, make straight his path, the highway of the Lord. And then they would crisscross to create all these crosses. And so this medieval urban planning was very intentional in terms of creating for people a mental map of a medieval cosmos. It's really quite cool. When you get into secular urban planning, all of that imaginative integration starts breaking down, and you actually get into zoning. And it's very fascinating with zoning and secular conceptions of things. With zoning, you can have a place only for government buildings, and then only for commercial buildings, and then only for apartments, and then only for single family homes, right? And then on and on and on. The integrative nature of the city, as it were, begins to fall apart. And that's largely because secularism is bifocal. It tends to see the world either as scientific or religious, either as fact or as faith, either as nature, biology, chemistry, physics, or as culture, either as public or as private. And that slashing effect of dichotomies can actually be seen in our urban planning today. So you go to Washington, D.C., of course, and you'll see all of these monuments and so forth, all centered around civil government mythology, as it were. Churches, even the two national churches, the Episcopal and the Catholic Church, are way off to the periphery. They are not at the center anymore. They're way off to the periphery. Same in New York City. New York City is a monument to the emerging commercial life. So it's skyscrapers and building and business, the sort of the Coolidge, sort of the business of America's business. Manhattan is a monument in many ways. And then, you could sneak in a little bit of the immigrant community belief system with St. Patrick's Cathedral and so forth. But again, it's just kind of, you're just walking along the road and all of a sudden, boom, there's a cathedral there. There's no rhyme or reason to it. So what we see in terms of the very well-planned sort of cosmic, sacred cosmos that was embedded in medieval urban planning sort of gets split apart in a secularized notion of space.
It keeps reminding me the things you've been saying of something Chesterton mentioned. I want to say it's in Orthodoxy, but it might be somewhere else. But he was saying that he remarked on the concept of the social contract. And he said, of course, there's no record of anybody having done anything like the social contract. You can't find any hint anywhere, any place in time, anywhere in anyone's history of two people saying, I won't hit you if you don't hit me.
Right.
What you will find lots of people saying is we must not hit each other in the sacred place.
Right.
And then once they start doing that, then at that point, they're able to work together enough that they start building things. So it reminds, starting with when you describe the Greek cities were founded with a temple and then sort of came out, there's very much an echo of that. And it's also interesting when you talk then about the secular spaces, when you get to the zoning, where it does have much more of the echo of an attempt to do the social contract of, all right, let's draw up a plan for this. Well, and it has very much that Enlightenment idea of whipping things out of nothing, out of sort of the nothingness of pure reason without any premises. That will just put it together. Whereas the older, more religious approach is that we find ourselves in a world that we're supposed to conform to. And so that the building then reflected the organization, the spaces that we make reflect where we come from, the universe in which we actually live, as opposed to attempting to mold the universe simply to our convenience.
Yeah, in many respects, if you think it through, the medieval city is a poem, whereas the modern city is a machine. It's a factory, with its basic parts, and we're cogs within that machine in many respects. That's why I think it's so interesting that our schools, our public school architecture, it's so dramatically different than what became relatively commonplace architectural standards after, say, 11th and 12th century. And that was something akin to what you would see almost like this Cambridge or Oxford Tudor style. Certainly in the North, you're seeing that. You see Gothic universities as they're developing out of the 11th and 12th centuries. having that kind of architecture in Germany and well, the Czech Republic today is saying Prague, for example. Places of learning were seen as paideia, and a paideia involved being initiated into a society, into the values, the belief systems of society. It always is. Education is always paideia, but in the medieval world, they really understood this. And so for those who were learned, those who received the education, they could find themselves in buildings that looked just like churches. They were absolutely sacred spaces for the contemplation of the true, the good, and the beautiful. That's what gets evoked when you step into these libraries and so on. I love checking out some of those websites. It'll say something like the 50 most beautiful libraries in the world. And they are stunning. And there is no way that you go into that space and say, oh, yeah, let's have an arcade here. It just doesn't evoke that kind of inclination or disposition. However, how do we think of education today? Well, it's still a paideia, but it's a paideia to initiate students very much into an industrial-based, financial world. It's no longer a sacred world. It's now very much, the industrial complex that they're being initiated into. So it's not, I don't think it's not even remotely a coincidence that our schools now look like factories. And if
often like prisons.
All right. If you want to go there, Christopher, you can. I'm going to say factories, but I know where you're coming from.
The thing is, I've been in factories, small factories, but I've been in factories, and I've also, for a little while, I was able to do a prison ministry. It's just a Bible study thing, like once a month, so practically nothing. But so I've been inside a prison, and schools look more like prisons than they do like factories. I mean, factories very often have, big open floor plans. They have, break rooms and so on. And, there's a fair amount of regulation in all of these things.
Sure.
Obviously. But at the same time, there's, within a factory, people will have their workspaces and so on. Whereas one of the curious things about both prisons and schools is that the people involved are are almost accessories to the space rather than the other way around. That in both a school and a prison, like, this is the place where something happens and people come in and do it and then leave. And there'll often be a stream. Like I actually went on a tour that they were giving for how it operates. And like in the lunchroom can fit something like a fifth or a sixth of the people housed in the prison. And so you get something like 10 minutes to eat or something. It's this almost like conveyor belt of people coming in and then leaving. And so, and throughout, when you look, it's very much like there's the space and people come into it to do something and then go out of it. Whereas factories tend to have more like, this is the place where I'm doing the work. And, you might have multiple shifts and so several people share, but there is, though it's very not directly analogous, there's something a lot closer to a craftsman in his workshop in the factory where you have your tools and the thing that you do. And, there may be, the pieces come along to you, brought to you on a cart or what have you, or, in some cases on conveyor belts. But nonetheless, like, the person is more rooted within a factory. Whereas in a school and within a prison, the people are, get moved around. The detail being that in a prison, then there's the, your cell that you go into when you're not supposed to be someplace else. Right. And I think schools, dormitory schools, though, function in a very similar way there, where if you're not supposed to be someplace else.
That's fascinating, because I think you're really onto something in terms of the factory, at least certainly having a utilitarian. The space has a utilitarian value to that is in harmony with the person that's working with it. Whereas, most schools, it's just you're just occupying the space that's already been set for you. Michel Foucault did a lot of work. The postmodern philosopher did a lot of work on the interrelationship between modern prisons and modern industrialized society. So I think you're on to something there. I will. That's my next project for research, I think. Prisons and schools. But you can't let my students know that. Then they're going to throw that at me. Hey, this is a prison, and I'm going to have to say, well, actually, in a sense, it is.
Well, there's another great thing. It was, I don't remember. It was some essay of Chesterton's where he talked about how modern employers don't understand leisure, and because leisure is a time when a man is not serving his employer's purposes but serving his own in a proper sense. And he was and you mentioned it has nothing to do with the length of work hours. If for some odd reason employers thought that they could get the most out of a man by working him only 2 hours a day, they would still have no concept of leisure,
Right.
because they would still view his other 22 hours during the day as in service of their own ends.
Right.
Whereas leisure would be where they're not in service of their ends. And he had a great line in there that if you regard a man as dirt, well, even dirt you have to let lie fallow for some time if you want to get something out of it.
Nice.
And so it's a fundamental sort of attitude. And it does strike me like one difference, although it's a practical difference, is still trying to get the most out of a man. But if you want to get the most out of a factory worker, you have to adapt the space to him to make him productive, to enable him to be productive in a more proper. You have to tailor the environment to the man,
right,
within a factory. But that's not true of either schools or prisons. So there's sort of that added, sort of very strong difference in.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. I like that a lot.
And it seems an echo actually of what you're saying about secular spaces, that within the within the city planning of the secular spaces, you would get this space is for doing this activity, and the people who want to do this activity have to go do it in this space because we've set aside this space for this activity. That it's not a anthropocentric is kind of the wrong word, but still it's not focused on primarily the human beings, but primarily on the space.
Right. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And again, it has to do with this compartmentalization of things. And that's, we learn that we are supposed to keep religious faith private by the fact that on Monday morning, when we're at the business meeting, we don't open in prayer. We learn that. We learn that lab reports and users manuals and balance sheets and the like are really, really important in a technological society. When we go to these same kind of meetings and we find that nobody quotes Plato when they're giving presentations. They're only appealing to charts and graphs and data and statistics and indicators. So how we indwell our space gives us a tremendous sense of reality and what is real, again, in a cultural sense. And I think the secular spaces that we inhabit inculcate distinctively secular dispositions and inclinations.
It's interesting because part of the function of a space, in the sense of any sort of space, but as we're sort of talking about it, is that what can be done is defined in large part by what can't be done within a space. To give a very simple example, like the children can play in a room because there can't be wolves within the room. The children can play in the backyard because we let the children out into the backyard only in backyards in which there will not be coyotes there to eat them.
Right.
And so the fact that the space has been carved out from things like the natural predators means that the vulnerable can then be there. And in a similar way, within a school, the fact that, especially like a university, to take a place that's not fully prisonized, in the way that because they're private institutions and they echo back to the medieval in the way that the modern industrialized schools don't. But within a room that gets set aside for philosophy, there is a general barring of the others of non-philosophical talk within this room, and that's what allows the philosophy to actually happen. Because if people go on and on about how their day is and current politics and whether or not they think that their favorite sports team is likely to win, there's no space for the philosophy to happen. So, and that ties in, I think, very, very strongly to what you were just saying about how when you exclude the religious aspects of life, it does mean that there are certain things that can happen unabated. But what's curious is how very, very narrow these things are. That they're we live in a very specialized age, but a sort of hyper specialized age by also interestingly excluding so much that's human. That and it's very, like, even jokes, for example, aren't all that appropriate within a business environment.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, right, exactly. You have to be very discerning on how you're going to use it. No, I think you're right. I mean, think even, cognitive psychology, clinical psychology, therapists, they're more and more recognizing, of course, the so-called health values to meditation and contemplation and the like. But I think that's, again, and then they come out and they think they have to, they have to give public service announcements to tell us, this is important. I guess we're going to have spiritual meditation week some point, spiritual meditation awareness week. I could maybe just a day because we don't have time for it. Maybe that's it, or something. But I think they are evoking precisely what you've got your finger on. We are more busy than we've ever been in human history. We're up more hours, we sleep less. We're all paying the toll of being part of a modern age of, well, in many ways, I think the Vegas casino is very much reflective of the modern age. No clocks, no sun, and it's a closed-in space that never ends 24/7. It just keeps going. There's no Sabbath. There's no rest, because in many respects, if you think it through, there's no space for it. Any space for it has just been cluttered out. Now, what we have to do then is we have to make space for it. But how do we make space for it when the spaces that we indwell teach us that all that's kind of irrelevant? This is what's really important: finance, capital, industrialism, liberalism, whatever it is. That's what's important. That's where it's all at. Why would I know something's wrong, but then why would I develop a disposition for contemplation if the spaces that I indwell tell me that that's irrelevant and that's not important to the good life as a modern industrialized society shares it? So no, I'm with you. I think that the spaces that modern life provides for us are very limited and very impoverished in terms of what makes us human. And I think many ways that's what post-secular scholars are getting at now, with sort of the revenge of the post-secular in architecture, in urban planning, in the return of sacred space, particularly in cities and urban life. We're beginning to see books and articles written on the notion of the post-secular city, on post-secular space, that would seek to, as we move into the future, would seek to take these concerns and translate them into actual materiality. So that's what's really cool. It's going on now.
You can also see too, I think in a multi-pronged sort of way, that whenever you try to fit human beings into something that's fundamentally inhuman, it's, in some sense, the human beings will give, especially for a while, but at some point, it's really the thing into which you're trying to fit them that starts to give. And an interesting example of that is, you see within offices, there is the move, because it was so efficient, to get rid of offices into cubicles.
Right.
Unfortunately, human beings just don't work very well when they're all on top of each other like that. Nobody has any space from each other.
Right.
And so there's that move back again, away from that and into offices, but also things too. Interestingly, you find things like noise canceling headphones that are really good at, that will actually actively cancel out the higher frequency sounds and use lower frequency, use padding to prevent higher frequency sounds, so that people can be talking to you and you will never hear them. And so what you get is a recreation of space for you to do something. Even if it's in some sense a physically smaller space, it becomes a mentally larger space that you carve out for yourself. Also interesting, I think, is the fact that anyone who runs a blog knows that their blog traffic goes down outside of work hours. That right. As soon as when does everybody's websites get the most traffic? It's during office hours.
Right.
And so you put people into this space that sort of excludes everything but business, and what happens? Well, everything but business comes back in.
That's great. It's a great corrective. Yeah.
It is, and so there's there is sort of, for some reason I'm reminded of that silly thing in the Conan movie about what's stronger than steel, and um, the villain of the story gave one answer, but there is a sense in which human beings, though externally softer than steel, tend to outlast it and wear it down. Because,
Mm-hmm.
of course, it's kind of a fascinating thing that's a trend within all of life. That dead things are tougher because they don't need to support living systems within them. But on the flip side, they also don't repair themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, a good example being, hair is an extremely tough thing. I mean, hair can pass through the digestive systems of animals. It can last for really long periods of time in the ground and so on. It's really, really tough in certain senses, but on the other hand, it once damaged, simply that's it. Steel again is very, very hard, but it gets worn down over time.
Right.
And human beings, though soft, well, we regenerate ourselves though.
Yeah.
So even though the steel is harder, and it's funny, you see this happening, over time, doorknobs, and universities are great places to see this, where doorknobs change shape over the years.
Mm.
Hand over hand over hand over hand is on them. Eventually, their finer features get worn down, they get smoothed down, and this is all by very soft hands constantly using them. But the hands restore themselves and the doorknob doesn't. And so it within these spaces that get set up for people, in order to shape the people, and frankly, in some sense, that may be the most, or the lowest level of the tie-in between schools and prisons is distinct from factories. Is the factories there to shape, for people to shape things, whereas the schools or prisons are there to shape people. Um, and yet, the people eventually wear down the things.
Yeah. By the way, Chris, I think you stumbled on a great commercial for your channel. We even talk about doorknobs. And then I want you to put under there something like, there is no more contemplative channel than soft hands wear down door handle. Oh, it's just beautiful. I love it. I absolutely love it. I think, yeah, again, I think these are great, great points. I do.
So it leads into what you're saying about where the post-secular society is shaping, as people are understanding that you can't you can't imprison people very effectively.
Yeah, and it's so I just love the way you put it there, because I have to say probably the most common complaint of discouragement that I hear is that things are just getting worse, things are just getting worse, the world's falling apart, blah blah blah. Like, we're the first generation to say that, by the way. And they just see this secular sort of edifice as just unstoppable, and it's just getting bigger and stronger and more powerful. And then, what you're pointing out is, we, of course, and you and I have talked about this, we've talked about the large macro level dynamics where that's certainly not the case. But as you're pointing out, you could go to some of the most micro, infinitesimally small details that are there, multiplied by trillions, of where, no, that's not the case. Humans have a nature, and no matter what you do to it, it's eventually going to break out. I'm still trying to figure out if Aldous Huxley ended Brave New World to basically say, we're screwed. I'm not going to give the ending away for those who haven't read it, but it's a brilliant, brilliant analysis on the modern secular age and technocracy, and like very similar to what maybe like That Hideous Strength of Lewis. But what makes those books for me so different is That Hideous Strength of Lewis ends with the return of Camelot, as it were, King Arthur and Merlin, and the medieval world gets its revenge in the end. It comes back. That's the beauty. The discarded image is discarded no more. It comes back. And technocracy is ultimately defeated by as a Babel curse. It was no more than Genesis 11 when all was said and done. You thought you were all advanced, and so no, you're at the beginning of the Bible. This is just where it all begins, So what I think we have to understand is human nature is very, very, very difficult to to squelch, as it were. I think I might have mentioned it to you before. The national average of atheism, hard atheism, now we're talking about hard atheism, is about 5% of the global population. At the end of the Soviet Union period, after 70 years of inculcation of hard atheism, the amount of atheists in a poll in 1991, the amount of atheists in the Soviet Union was, or just after its fall, so it would have been now the Russian Republic, was 6%. The world average is 5%. 70 years of an intentional effort to inculcate atheism gave them 1% more atheists. You can't destroy human nature.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And there's an interesting example of talking about that subject about people who are inclined to think like, oh, the secularism is completely winning, and I think there's a very interesting way of seeing the fundamental problem that's had here. If you look at the concept of political correctness, and if you look, and in particular, because there are a lot of people who are trying to push it and constantly coming up with new terms, and the very fact that they have to constantly come up with new terms itself points to the fundamental problem that they have, because their goal essentially is to make it impossible for within the language for people to insult each other. And they are completely and utterly unsuccessful at that. The moment that you replace, I don't even remember what the term that was before retarded, because at one time retarded was the term that, since it meant slowed down, that was the nice new term that didn't have any of the baggage of the previous
mentally
term.
Handicapped is what I've heard.
I think that came after retarded.
Mentally challenged. What's that?
I thought that was after retarded. It was something like slow or dim or something like that.
So
then that got replaced by retarded in an attempt to soften it.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then that got replaced by something like mentally handicapped, and eventually by mentally challenged. They don't even know what we're on to. But no matter what term they come up with, people just start using it as an insult. Yeah. And that project to attempt to make it impossible to insult people simply founders, because no matter how much you do it, human beings, for better or for worse, sometimes for both, are going to insult each other.
I don't know how guys would actually greet one another if we didn't have insults, if you think about it.
Yeah, no matter, and this is also the curious thing, no matter what term you're trying to use, as long as anyone can figure out what it means, at some point, those terms that describe something that people don't want to happen to them will be used in an aggressive fashion. And so it's a good example of, because in one sense, yes, the people who are trying to do this have a lot of control in some institutions. On the other hand, the very fact that they are constantly working at it and constantly trying so very hard shows you just how much they have not yet succeeded.
Right. Oh, absolutely. No, I think you're exactly right. And I think you're right too, that no matter, again, you can't stop human nature no matter what word you come up with. We're always, a comedian at the very least will always find a way of being able to turn it into something you just never thought of. I could still think of that comedian who was it Mitch Hedberg. If you know Mitch Hedberg, he said, I'm always he's a crazy comedian. I'm always nervous about waving to somebody across the street, because what if he doesn't have any arms? Then it just looks like I'm showing off. Look what man. I can wave, I can pick stuff up. He starts going on, and you never thought about it. So are we going to ban waving now because it might make somebody else feel bad because they don't have art? It just goes insane. At some point, you're going to have to defer back to the good old-fashioned, values of wisdom and virtue. All right, if you don't have any arms, arms aren't the end of the world. That's why God has cultivated wisdom within you to bring you in a different direction, or something. Have the virtue and the courage to be able to stand up against all the setbacks in life and so on. Stop trying to just eliminate setbacks while you still have a bunch of crying mamby-pambies in the background.
Yeah. Well, and relatedly too to human nature, like, people will go along with things to a certain degree, and at some point when you push them too far, they just say no, we're done. And this always catches the people who are pushing by surprise. But it's kind of interesting. Like, I remember one thing for a while, there was supposedly clapping triggered some people. Possibly, there were it may even have come out of concern for people with actual neurological issues where loud, sharp sounds actually did trigger something in them. But at the same time, whether or not any of these people actually, voiced problems with this, I'm not sure. But out of this came the idea of replacing clapping with jazz hands. But then other people, as opposed to clapping. But then other people pointed out this is cultural appropriation and various things. And so far as I've heard, nobody's come up with a replacement. They've just given up, and everyone goes back to clapping because, well, at some point,
Right.
no, this is just too much work.
Right.
It's too much work that's involved. No.
Exactly.
And that sort of thing does happen. Again, talking about that human nature, that is what sort of tends to happen, that you push people and you push people, and they're willing to accommodate you up to a certain point. And at some point you push them too far, and then they just say no. And but on a related note, actually, of people adapting spaces again to themselves, or within the secular industrialized world, where so very many people are saddled with a commute to and from work that they have to do. But you then get something very interesting. Bishop Barron has a very interesting video on prayer, and he's giving his advice on prayer. And part of his take the time. That one of the most important things about prayer is just take the time to actually do it. It was actually quoting somebody. I forget at the moment, but he gave the advice, or possibly was relaying the advice he had heard. But your daily commute's actually a great time to pray. It's like a little monastic cell. You have space and you have time, so you can pray. And so it's a good example of where within that, the industrialized society is trying to be so efficient, but it nonetheless creates actually a space in which one can pray.
Right.
So a person has to do it on purpose, but
yeah, and if you bring the Eastern Orthodox into this, my fellow Eastern Orthodox, I mean, they'll create a whole, iconostasis in their front dashboard, man. They'll have it all, It's just so there's no excuses not to be praying.
And that's actually, a great example too, interestingly, of because space is defined in one sense by what it excludes, but also, as you just pointed out, by what it includes. And so things like the iconostasis across the for those who don't know the Greek, that's the wall of icons within a Greek church that separates the altar from the main portion. So the wall of icons helps to set the nature for what the space is. So it helps you, in a sense, this actually, of course, brings in time. It helps you to remember what you should be doing when you're in the space. So that aspect of the space then crosses time to bring you from whatever your concerns of the moment are to remembering what your concerns should be.
Nice. Yeah. And that is precisely the emergence in a microcosm. I think you just captured the emergence of post-secular space. That this notion of recreating the sense of memory, self, retraditionalization in spaces. That's big in these intentional communities that are developing these things called the new gig now in architecture is called placemaking, which is pretty cool. Placemaking is sort of the new urbanism. It's a form of the new urbanism where we're not just like buying a property of land and then again via zoning just putting a bunch of houses there. No, we're buying a big plot of land, and then we're putting houses, we're putting markets, intentionally putting schools, intentionally putting pubs, restaurants, and what do you know? Just the way we used to think of urban space back in the day, that it was actually a place that of conviviality, of community, of communion. This notion is really hot right now. We actually have a development that's in Delaware now called Whitehall, and it's not even, they don't even, normally we'd call it just Whitehall development or something like that. No, they're calling it the town of Whitehall. This is going to be 900 houses. It's going to be several business spaces, several places for restaurants and pubs. There a place for places for schools, churches, you name it. It's an intentional placemaking. It's not so much there's space that needs to be filled, but it's more getting the idea that humans indwell space, and therefore the space has to be human. It has to be humane in that sense. So it's really pretty cool what's going on. You see Russia itself, after all those centuries of communism and that destroyed its churches. I think it had upwards of about 60,000 churches throughout its landscape, as it were. And then in 1991, they were down to 6,000 churches, which is utterly devastating. Well, now they're back up to around 36,000 churches. So we're seeing, we're seeing this extreme. Yeah, it's about 1,000 churches a year, right? 30 years or so since the fall of Russia. So we're just seeing just this amazing sense of return of in this case, post-secular space, whereas Tsarist Russia would have been pre-secular. I mean, we're seeing things like we're seeing mass mosque projects going on throughout the Middle East, because more Muslims are going to mosques than ever before, interestingly enough. We're seeing India is in the process. India's in the process of building today the largest Hindu temple in all of India. It's right near the border of Nepal. And when done, it's a complex that'll cover about 200 acres.
Wow.
That's just how massive this thing is. It'll be they're planning it to have the highest Hindu temple spire in the world as well. It's not a coincidence that's happening now. Right? Again, scholars 50 years ago would have said those things are done. That's over. They're going to put some big insurance building or something up there. So, no, they're going back to a re-traditionalized conception of space, because precisely because, again, I think you've identified so many of the things that secularism left out in its arrangement of space that post-secularism is bringing back. But now with ingenuity that we accumulated during the secularism, now we can build the biggest Hindu temple. Or in Bucharest, Romania, they are currently building what will be the tallest and largest Orthodox church in the world. It's again just massive. I forget what it was, but just 360 feet long, and then like 360 feet high or something. Just this unbelievably massive building. And it's even being used, interestingly enough, as a basis for international relations. So you have the first Hindu temple being built in Abu Dhabi right now at the United Arab Emirates, as a token of goodwill between the two nations as they do business and trade together. The prince of or king of the area of Abu Dhabi has said, come on in and go ahead and build a Hindu temple here. And again, it's just this: how do you show a token of goodwill? Well, one of the ways you do so is by allowing the religious faith of your partner, your alliance, build a monument to that faith in your own space. So it's pretty fascinating what's going on now with the possibilities of post-secular space.
That is very interesting. It's curious to see. There's also, interestingly, although it's not physical space, yet it often feels like it online, where you have communities that form in spaces, things like chat rooms, Discord servers, in times gone by, IRC, although, still have that, web chat boards, comment sections, people who just know each other on Twitter. You get what become, in some sense, a space analog. They're like spaces. They're the people of us who are talking here and nobody else is here.
Right.
Sorts of spaces. Things like on YouTube.
Right.
And so it's also interesting to see this, especially as we talk about the post-secular age, how people are doing the sorts of spaces or space analog things people are making online, where they become, all the different things that one can go to, where, they have their religious function, the people one can talk to about religion, places people go to pray together just online. So you can see that element of the human spirit, and something like the same way we deal with physical space online as well.
Yeah, technically they're calling it third spaces, right? It's sort of Starbucks kind of Starbucks sort of embodies the whole notion of third space. But so first space is sort of like an aerial view of planning space. When I was talking about urban planning in the medieval period, that would be sort of first space. And the second space is kind of like the mythologies and the symbols and the ideologies related to space. Yeah, third space is just exactly what you and I are doing right now. How do people interact in the spaces that they're given? And what is really cool is, as we're emerging in this post-secular world, is we have now the capacity to communicate with one another in third space like contexts that transcend frontiers. They transcend boundaries. It's amazing stuff. So over at my channel there on Turley Talks, I mean, we're chatting with people from all over the world. You know, if I put up a video on Poland or something, I'll get all these people from Poland saying, yeah, this, that, or they'll affirm me, or they'll tell me, yeah, you're full of it, you don't know, whatever it is. But it's amazing now that we can. And then somebody from Hungary would of course say, well, I want to, affirm my fellow Pole, and all this great stuff. It's amazing that we have third spaces now that actually span the globe. It's not just the tavern. I think the local tavern's really important. You got to have that. But it's also something like what you and I are doing right now. And then when our listeners and all that sort of stuff are coming in, we're all united around a certain kind of space where we're inclined towards one another in new and exciting ways.
All right. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. And well, thank you very much. It's been, as always, just a very, very interesting conversation.
Thank you, Christopher.
God bless.
God bless you.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed that as much as I did. I've enjoyed all of my conversations with Dr. Turley, and I thought this one hit some very interesting subjects. So I'll have links in the description if you want to check out Dr. Turley's stuff. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.